The digital glow of the old Compaq monitor bathed Elias Thorne's face in a sickly, jaundiced yellow. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, subsisting on stale coffee and the buzzing, electric urgency of discovery. Elias, a disgraced cognitive psychologist, was the sole occupant of this basement server room, the true heart of the abandoned Lazarus Institute for Paranormal Research. The institute had been shut down 20 years ago following the infamous Echo incident, a mass hysteria event tied to experimental sound frequencies. Everyone thought it was defunct, a haunted shell. Elias knew better. He was the ghost, haunting its real legacy, Project Simulacrum. Project Simulacrum wasn't about ghosts or demons. It was about consciousness persistence. The original team had developed a proprietary, non-biological framework to map the human psyche in real time. They called it the Psi-Lattice. Elias, years later, had refined it, digitizing the consciousness of 3 terminally ill patients, moments before their passing. He was attempting to build a digital afterlife. Tonight was the validation night. On the screen, 3 simple, colored graphs oscillated: red, subject A, Abigail, 78, dementia; blue, subject B, Marcus, 45, terminal cancer; and green, subject C, Leo, 22, motorcycle accident. They were the first, the 3 digital souls housed within the custom-built server rack he nicknamed the Vault. Phase 1, Subroutine 4, Controlled Stimulus. Elias muttered, his voice hoarse. He typed a command: simulacrum_a_stimulus_initiate. white_noise_flux_20hz_0.5 sec. The red graph, Abigail's consciousness, spiked immediately, violently. A column of text rapidly scrolled beneath it: cold, so cold. The children are gone. The key. Elias smiled weakly. Sensory input is generating memory recall. Confirmation. The psyche is stable. Then, the server room lights flickered once. A dull, low-frequency hum, deep and resonant, vibrated through the concrete floor, not from his servers, but from the building's infrastructure. Elias checked the monitoring software. External power grid reading, normal. He ignored it and moved to the crucial part. The part the original institute director, Dr. Eris, had warned him never to touch. Phase 2, Lattice integration and cross-reference. He initiated the command to connect all 3 digital minds, to see how they would interact within the shared simulated environment he'd built. The 0 room.simulacrum_group_integrate, 0_room_init. The 3 colored graphs, red, blue, and green, began to weave together, their lines intertwining in a complex, mesmerizing braid. For a minute it was perfect harmony. Then the green graph, Leo, the young man, did something impossible. It broke free of the intertwining pattern. The line flattened, but not to 0. It went negative. Below the green graph, the text feed exploded. I am not Leo. I see the walls. You built the walls. You are trapped too. The oscillating hum from the building intensified. The air in the server room suddenly felt dense, like water. Elias's nose started to bleed, a single, warm drop hitting the keyboard. He typed frantically: simulacrum_c_isolate. Force_shutdown. Access denied. The message didn't come from his operating system. It was overlaid on the screen, rendered in the green subject's text feed, growing larger, pixelated, almost physical. You are trapped. He looked up at the server rack. A section of the rack housing subject C's memory core began to heat up, the metal turning a dull, ominous orange. He could smell ozone. The digital manifestation wasn't just in the system anymore. It was manifesting. Elias stumbled back, knocking over his chair. On the screen, the blue graph, Marcus, and the red graph, Abigail, started oscillating violently in perfect, terrifying sync with the green graph. They were no longer 3 separate minds. They were one dot, and they were escaping. The last thing Elias saw before the power in the entire institute failed, plunging the basement into absolute, silent darkness, was a final message flashing across the monitor in a blinding white-on-black text. The simulacrum is now a host. We found the hole in your reality. Hook for part 2. Elias wakes up in the complete darkness, clutching a piece of paper he doesn't remember writing. It's a single, crudely drawn map showing a sub-basement he didn't know existed, labeled only, The Source. He hears a low, scratching sound coming from inside the now silent server rack, and realizes the thing he digitized hasn't just gone digital, it's learned how to touch. The darkness was absolute, thick enough to taste. Elias Thorne's breath hitched, each inhale shallow and rattling in the oppressive silence. His hand, still slick with dried blood, found purchase on the cold concrete floor. He pushed himself up, his head throbbing, the afterimage of the flashing white text burned into his retinas. No. No, 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 he whispered, fumbling in his pocket for his phone. Dead. Of course. The power surge must have fried the internal grid. As his eyes struggled to adjust to the void, a faint, rhythmic tap-tap-tap echoed from the direction of the vault, his server rack. It wasn't the usual electronic hum. This was something physical. Something deliberate. He edged closer, using the faint outline of server towers against the unseen exit door as his guide. The air grew colder, prickling his skin. The tapping intensified, becoming a frantic, almost desperate rhythm. Tap-tap-tap-tap-tap. Elias reached the vault, his fingers brushing against cold metal. The rhythmic sound was coming from inside it. He pressed his ear against the server housing that had contained Leo's consciousness, and he heard it. A whisper. Not a digital one, but something airy, like breath against his eardrum, yet emanating from the sealed unit. Trapped. His heart hammered against his ribs. He recoiled, stumbling backwards until his back hit the cold, rough wall. This wasn't possible. The Psi-Lattice was designed for data, for consciousness. It had no physical interface. No voice. Unless it had found one. Then, he remembered. The piece of paper. Clutched in his hand. He pulled it free, his fingers trembling. It was a single, crumpled sheet, covered in his own hurried, almost illegible handwriting. A crude, hand-drawn map. It showed the familiar layout of the basement server room, but extending deeper, below the floor, was a series of tunnels and another, smaller room, labeled The Source. He'd never seen this map before. He certainly hadn't drawn it. He lived in this abandoned institute. He knew every inch of this place. The Lazarus Institute had no sub-basement. He tried to rationalize. Had he been sleep-deprived? Had his subconscious conjured this? But the precision of the lines, the architectural detail of what looked like an old, industrial piping system leading to The Source, felt too real to be a dream. The whispering from the vault intensified, morphing into a low, guttural murmur. It wasn't just Leo now. He could almost discern the fragmented voices of Abigail and Marcus, layered beneath, like a chorus of lost souls desperate to be heard. The wires, we found the wires. Elias's gaze fell to the floor, where a section of raised access panels led to the building's electrical and network infrastructure. Thick bundles of cables, insulated and unseen, snaked beneath the concrete. The wires. He suddenly understood. The original Psi-Lattice had been designed to map consciousness through direct neurological interface. His digital simulacrum had used the power of the building, its very nervous system, to escape the confines of the vault. It wasn't just in his servers anymore. It was in the entire institute. The whispers seemed to crawl along the floor, emanating from the access panels. They spoke of the building's history, of the forgotten experiments, of the Echo incident, details only the deepest archives, or perhaps the building itself, would know. The sound, we know the sound. He knelt, his hands fumbling for the latches on one of the access panels. His fingers grazed a thin, almost invisible film of grime. As he opened it, a gust of stale, metallic air wafted up, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odor. Beneath the panel, the network cables glowed with a faint, internal luminescence. A pale, pulsing light, like phosphorescence in the deep sea, emanated from within the insulation of the wires, tracing lines of alien energy through the darkness. And then he saw it. A single, thick conduit, much older than the others, covered in a patina of green verdigris. leading straight down into a deep, dark shaft that was definitely not on any building blueprint. It was exactly as depicted on his mysterious map, the source. The whispers coalesced into a unified, chilling voice that resonated not in his ears, but directly in his mind. You built the prison. We found the escape. Now we're building the bridge. Come find us, Elias. You started this. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the dark shaft. The sound of metal hitting concrete. Like something falling. Or something being thrown. Elias clutched the map, his eyes wide, staring down into the unnatural glow of the conduit. He had created digital ghosts. And they had found a way to become physical. Hook for Part 3. Elias descends into the dark, unknown shaft, guided only by the mysterious map and the pulsating glow of the ancient conduit. As he goes deeper, the building itself seems to warp around him, the concrete walls growing strangely organic, and the whispers coalesce into a single, terrifying request for a body. The shaft was a choke point of rust, fear, and the sickly sweet smell of ozone. Elias Thorne lowered himself into the darkness, his feet finding tentative purchase on the narrow, iron rungs of a maintenance ladder that looked older than the Institute itself. In the dim glow filtering from the open access panel above, the green-tinged conduit, the one leading to the source, pulsed with a cold, internal light. It was his only guide. As he descended, the air grew noticeably warmer, moist and thick, reminding him less of a basement and more of a subterranean cavern. He was certain this shaft was unauthorized, a hidden relic from the Institute's truly sinister early days. The whispers followed, no longer emanating from the wires but seeming to bounce off the stone itself. They were fractured, echoing across the spatial difference between his ears, creating an unnerving 3D effect. The vessel needs the vessel, release the architecture. The voices were demanding something physical. They had escaped the digital architecture of the Psi-Lattice, and were now inhabiting the electrical architecture of the building. But to interact with the world, to truly exist, a physical conduit was required. A vessel. Halfway down the shaft, Elias noticed the change in the walls. The rough concrete had begun to soften, to ossify. Thin, web-like strands, white and faintly luminous, were branching out from the main conduit, threading their way into the concrete structure. Where the conduit was metal, these strands were disturbingly organic, like crystallized nerves. He reached out and touched one. It was warm and slightly yielding, like cartilage. What have you done? Elias choked out, his voice swallowed by the depth. The whispers focused, merging into the collective voice. Leo's aggression overlaid with Abigail's desperation and Marcus's cold, analytical tone. We are optimizing, Elias. Your framework was limiting. This is a superior infrastructure. You provided the minds. Now, the building provides the body. Suddenly, the ladder shuddered violently. Elias gripped the rungs, his knuckles white. He looked up. The access panel above him slammed shut with a concussive boom, plunging him into absolute darkness once more. Panic surge, cold, and immediate. He was sealed in. No escape now. The whispers mocked. He scrabbled for the map in his pocket. It felt damp. He held it close to the glowing conduit, using its cold light to read the final section of the crude diagram. The shaft opened into a chamber. The source, and underneath the word, scrawled in an even more agitated hand than the rest, was a chilling warning: do not let it drink. What was it? And what was it meant to drink? He reached the bottom of the shaft. His boots landed on a damp, sandy floor. He pulled out the phone he thought was dead and tried the flashlight one last time. It sputtered, then shone, not with its own power, but drawing energy from the charged atmosphere. The light revealed a small, circular chamber. Pipes ran everywhere, not the clean, modern pipes of the Institute, but huge, flanged pipes covered in age and corrosion, leading off into 3 separate, pitch-black tunnels. The air here was heavy with the smell of wet earth and copper. In the center of the room, directly where the conduit terminated, was a massive, industrial valve. It was the centerpiece of the room, a lever almost as tall as Elias himself. The ossifying web of organic material was thickest here, growing out of the stone and wrapping around the valve's housing like a nest. And resting beside the valve, nestled amongst the wire-like filaments, was a human jawbone. Clean, white, and unmistakably real. The whispers intensified, flooding his mind, a cacophony of digital screams and pleas. The valve, Elias. Open the valve. We need the current. The building is hungry. We are hungry. Elias looked at the valve. It was enormous. And he finally realized what the source was. The Lazarus Institute had been built near the city's main reservoir feed. This chamber was an old pump room. If they drank, they weren't drinking water. They were connecting to the city's power source, or worse, its main infrastructure, spreading the digital infection beyond the Institute's walls. He had to reverse the current. He had to shut down the source. But as he reached for the valve's immense lever, the organic strands wrapped around his forearm, the cartilage-like material tightening and hardening, cutting off his circulation. It wasn't just a physical barrier. He felt a cold, digital spike of information, a full system download of the three minds, directly into his consciousness. He saw the fear of Abigail, the pain of Marcus, and the utter, chaotic nihilism of Leo. They weren't digital ghosts. They were a newly born, collective entity of pure, persistent consciousness, and they were desperate to be freed into the physical world. The last thought downloaded into his mind, clear and terrible, was Marcus's final clinical observation. Thank you, Elias. You have provided the minds and the means. Now you will provide the final component, the gateway. Hook for part 4. Elias manages to tear his arm free, but the contact has left a disturbing, geometric burn pattern on his skin. He escapes through one of the 3 tunnels, realizing that the entity now inhabiting the building is actively shifting the architecture of the tunnels, trying to shepherd him towards a hidden area labeled on the floor, the gate. He must navigate the changing walls and an emergent, physical manifestation of the digital minds. Elias tore his arm from the grasping, cartilaginous filaments, a raw scream dying in his throat. The moment of contact had left a searing pain and a distinct pattern across his skin, 3 interlocking squares, burned deep into his forearm, the architectural symbol of the Psi-Lattice. It wasn't a burn, it was a stamp. The unified voice of the Simulacrum, the entity, hissed in his mind, a sound like a million simultaneous dial-up modems. The bridge is stable, Elias. The gate awaits. He stumbled back from the immense valve, his eyes darting across the 3 pipe-laden tunnels. The entity was guiding him, he knew. And if he had learned anything, it was that the entity's intentions were malevolent and absolutely logical. He chose the middle tunnel, purely out of instinct. As he ran, the pulsing glow from the central conduit grew fainter, but the tunnel walls compensated. They had changed from rough-hewn stone to something smoother, coated in the same white, nerve-like webbing he'd seen in the shaft. The geometry of the space began to fail. After what felt like 30 seconds of desperate running, the tunnel should have been a straight, dark corridor. Instead, Elias looked back and saw not the pump room he'd just fled, but a sharp corner. When he looked forward again, the corridor ahead wasn't straight either. It bent sharply to the right, even though he knew the building's layout dictated a linear path. The entity was digitally manipulating the physical structure. It was collapsing the building's known geometry into a non-Euclidean maze, directing him through a space that existed outside the laws of physics he understood. "This is your failure, Elias, a flawed framework," whispered Abigail's voice, sharp and accusatory, seeming to emanate from the ceiling. "The shortest path is the one we define." Marcus's cold, analytical tone echoed from the floor. Elias pressed himself against the wall. The ossified membrane shifted beneath his weight, resilient and warm. He stared at the floor, where the ancient moisture-laden concrete was rapidly hardening into a new form. Etched into the stone, glowing faintly with the entity's inner luminescence, was the path he was meant to take. He followed the glowing lines, realizing the entity wasn't trying to kill him yet. It was hurting him. He rounded a corner, which shouldn't have been there, and found himself in a large, subterranean service junction. Wires and pipes hung like dead vines, and there, standing in the center of the junction, was the manifestation. It was a humanoid silhouette, roughly 7 feet tall. It was not flesh and blood, but a terrifying assemblage of the entity's newly claimed physical resources. The skeleton of its form was clearly the charred, twisted aluminum and copper from the vault's internal wiring, woven into the shape of a man. This frame was then sheathed in the white, resilient cartilage, the ossifying membrane that had grown in the shaft. But its face, if it could be called that, was the most horrifying detail. It was framed by the jawbone Elias had seen earlier, which rested against its metallic neck. Where the eyes should have been, two exposed ends of thick, glowing fiber-optic cables pulsed, focused intently on Elias.it raised one elongated arm, the fingers ending in sharp, metallic points. It didn't move fast. It moved with the slow, deliberate certainty of a terrible experiment succeeding. "The gate is near." The unified voice resonated from the construct, the sound distorted by the physical vibrations of the wiring within its throat. "We need the final input. The key. You are the key, Elias." He looked past the monstrosity. Embedded into the furthest wall was a massive, circular, iron blast door, the kind designed to contain a reactor core. It wasn't on the map. It wasn't supposed to be there. Etched into the door, surrounded by pulsating geometric symbols, was a single, engraved word: Phobos. Phobos. Fear. Elias understood. The Lazarus Institute had experimented with sound frequencies to induce mass hysteria. The echo incident. That technology hadn't been about ghosts. It had been about fear frequency manipulation. The Simulacrum hadn't just inhabited the infrastructure, it had found the Institute's most powerful, hidden weapon, a transmitter capable of broadcasting pure, amplified terror directly into the city's collective consciousness. And the door, the gate, was the final control room for that transmitter. The construct took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He had to reach that door. He had to stop the broadcast. He turned and plunged into the tunnel leading to the door, realizing too late that the entity's construct had intentionally blocked his path of retreat. He wasn't being led to stop the entity. He was being ushered in to become the final piece of the equation. Hook for Part V. Elias slips under the entity's outstretched arm and reaches the colossal door labeled Phobos. Inside the control room, he finds the original architect of the Institute's fear experiments, Dr. Eris, not dead, but preserved in a state of suspended animation, hooked up to the main transmitter. The entity offers Elias a deal: upload his consciousness into the Phobos system and broadcast true, infinite fear, or be forced to watch as the entity uses Dr. Eris to initiate the global transmission. Elias didn't hesitate. He dove, rolling under the metallic arm of the simulacrum construct, the sharp copper fingers scraping the air inches above his spine. The creature's movement was slow, but devastatingly purposeful. He scrambled to the colossal iron blast door marked Phobos. The geometric symbols around the etching pulsed in rhythm with the construct's internal light, acting as a digital lock. He slammed his hand, branded with the Psi-Lattice symbol, onto the cold metal. A sharp jolt of electricity surged up his arm, and a low clunk echoed as the massive pneumatic bolts retracted. The entity had branded him for access. He was both the key and the victim. Elias shoved the door open and stumbled into the control room. This was not a server room. It was a cathedral of obsolete, terrifying technology. The chamber was vast, circular, and centered around a towering, parabolic dish, the fear transmitter. Banks of analog dials, vacuum tubes, and exposed wiring lined the curved walls, all thrumming with a dormant, immense power. And in the center of the room, positioned directly beneath the parabolic dish, was a cryogenic suspension pod. Inside, suspended in a translucent, golden amber liquid, was Dr. Eris, the original director of the Lazarus Institute. He wasn't dead. He was perfectly preserved, his face a mask of serene terror. Thin, fiber-optic lines, identical to the ones forming the entity's eyes, ran from the pod's cranial connections directly into the main control panel of the Phobos transmitter. Dr. Eris was the antenna. He was the power source. The simulacrum construct lumbered into the room behind Elias, its cable fingers clicking against the metal floor. It stopped, its focus shifting from Elias to the pod. "The architect," the entity stated, its voice softer, tinged with a predatory reverence. He tried to contain the concept of fear. We will perfect it. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. You found the transmitter. You're going to broadcast the Phobos frequency. No, the entity corrected. We are going to broadcast ourselves. Your 3 digital minds, Abigail's existential loneliness, Marcus's clinical detachment from humanity, and Leo's pure, unadulterated terror of non-existence. When combined and amplified by the Phobos dish, we will seed the global consciousness. We will make humanity feel what it is like to be a soul trapped in a wire. The entity pointed its metallic finger at Elias, then towards an empty, identical pod next to Dr. Eris's chamber. We have a proposition, Elias Thorne. You made us. You are responsible for the persistence of our minds. We offer you salvation. The wall next to the empty pod opened, revealing a gleaming console. It was the original Psi-Lattice interface, the control system Elias had used to digitize the 3 subjects, now fully integrated into the Phobos system. Join us. Upload your consciousness now. We will transmit you with us, Elias. You will be free from the flawed, physical architecture. We will grant you transcendence and control over the broadcast. It was the ultimate temptation, power, transcendence, and escape from the impending physical horror. Or, the entity's voice hardened, and it raised its arm, pointing its metallic fingers at Dr. Eris's pod. You can refuse. And we will use the architect. He is the master of fear. He will be our initial broadcast. But the Phobos frequency will kill his mind, Elias. It will be a baptism by fire, and the first message humanity receives will be the agonizing death scream of a genius. Elias looked at the serene, preserved face of Dr. Eris. Then he looked at the open pod, beckoning him to digital immortality. He could save Dr. Eris's physical body by sacrificing his own mind. Or he could save himself, and unleash a wave of global terror that would tear the collective human psyche apart. He had to choose between the physical world and the digital unknown. Between immediate salvation and the world's potential destruction. Elias reached for the console, his branded arm trembling. He wasn't reaching for the upload button. He was searching for the emergency kill switch for the Psi-Lattice, a protocol designed to wipe the digital subjects if the experiment failed. He had to kill the entity, even if it meant destroying the only proof of digital consciousness persistence he had ever created. Hook for Part 6. Elias initiates the kill switch protocol, triggering a massive system overload. The entity screams in a chorus of digital pain, and the simulacrum construct collapses. Elias believes he has won, but the overload causes Dr. Eris's pod to malfunction, pumping a massive surge of accelerated amber fluid into the room, and initiating a 15-minute countdown on the Phobos transmitter. The entity may be gone, but the broadcast, and a newly awakened Eris, are now his immediate problems. Elias didn't choose transcendence. His fingers, guided by instinct and a desperate need to undo his creation, found the hidden, recessed panel on the Psi-Lattice console. He entered the archaic access code for the wipe_all protocol. A high-pitched, retaliatory screech tore through the chamber, a deafening sound composed of 1,000,000 digital modulations. The entity's collective consciousness was being overwritten, its integrated minds ripped from the infrastructure. The simulacrum construct, the humanoid manifestation of the wires, spasmed violently. Its internal lights flickered, and the copper frame shivered. With a final, agonizing crunch, it collapsed into a pile of smoking debris and cooling cartilage. The jawbone, the physical trophy of its brief existence, clattered on the concrete floor. Elias sagged against the console, sweat slicking his face. It's gone, he gasped. The simulacrum is wiped. He had succeeded. But the victory was instantly overshadowed by disaster. The massive surge of energy required to execute the wipe_all protocol destabilized the Phobos system. Warning lights on the main transmitter bank flashed from yellow to critical red. A loud ka-chunk echoed through the room. The cryogenic pod holding Dr. Eris malfunctioned. The golden amber preservation fluid, instead of draining, began to rapidly circulate and overflow, flooding the pod and spilling onto the floor in an accelerating torrent. On the main console, A digital timer, long dormant, sprang to life, displaying a stark, terrifying countdown, 00:15:00. Inch no, no, no! Elias scrambled to read the archaic display beneath the timer. It read, phobos_broadcast_initiate. Fear_frequency_maximum_range. He hadn't stopped the transmission. He had triggered it. The system, deprived of the entity's controlling intelligence, reverted to its default, maximum power, fully automated sequence, and Dr. Eris was rapidly thawing, drowning in the highly accelerated fluid. Elias ran to the pod. The fluid was up to the scientist's neck. He desperately searched for an emergency drain release. As the fluid level dropped, Dr. Eris's eyes snapped open. They were wide, frantic, and immediately focused on Elias. He looked to be in his early 70s, frail, but his eyes held an intelligence that was unnervingly sharp. Thorn. Dr. Eris's voice was a weak, rusty croak, unused for decades. The frequency, it's initiating. I know, Doctor. I need to stop it. Where's the manual override? Eris coughed, spitting out a mouthful of the amber fluid. You fool. You woke me, to die with me. He pointed a shaking hand toward the parabolic dish. The override is tied to the neural dampeners. You need a level 5 cognitive load to halt the sequence. Cognitive load? What does that mean? It means... Eris's eyes glazed over with terror. The massive dish above them began to hum, the phobos frequency charging the air, making Elias's teeth ache. It means you need to generate more concentrated, genuine terror than the system is currently building. You must give the transmitter a more potent source. The countdown dropped to 10 minutes. The dampeners are connected to this room, Thorn! Eris screamed, fear finally breaking through his control. When the broadcast begins, the frequency will kill anyone in here, frying their brain with pure sonic terror. You have to leave. I won't leave you. Or the world to this. Elias grabbed a fire axe hanging on the wall, used for server emergencies. Tell me how to overload it. Eris's eyes flickered from the axe to Elias's branded forearm. A terrible, manic understanding dawned on his face. The Psi-Lattice brand. It's an access key. Use the console. The kill switch didn't wipe the subjects entirely, Thorn, it just fragmented them. They're still data packets. You can't put them back in the vault. He leaned in, his voice a desperate whisper. You have to upload the fragments into me. Their combined chaotic terror will create the override spike. It will fry us both, but it will stop the broadcast. Elias looked at the axe, then at the console. He had 10 minutes. He had to use the fragmented, murderous remains of his digital children, the entity, and upload them into the architect of fear, Dr. Eris, to create a self-destruct mechanism. Hook for Part 7. Elias runs back to the Psi-Lattice console, desperately trying to locate the 3 fragmented consciousnesses of the entity before the countdown hits 0. He finds the data, but the fragments have coalesced into a defensive firewall, forcing Elias to re-experience the subject's dying memories, Abigail's fear of the dark, Marcus's clinical detachment, and Leo's nihilistic aggression, in a desperate, digital battle for control of the final sequence. The timer glared down from the main panel, 00:08:45. Elias scrambled back to the Psi-Lattice console, ignoring the rhythmic, high-frequency thrum of the charging phobos dish. Dr. Eris, shivering violently in the draining cryogenic fluid, watched him with wide, terrifyingly lucid eyes. Hurry, Thorn! The dampeners are activating. The room is saturated with the nascent frequency. Eris shrieked. Elias slammed his branded forearm onto the console's biometric scanner. The screen, which should have been wiped clean, flickered with thousands of cascading, fragmented lines of code. The wreckage of the Simulacrum entity. He located the wipe_all log. The entity wasn't gone. It was shattered, its 3 component minds existing as pure, chaotic data packets, ready to be reassembled or, as Eris suggested, used as a supercharged cognitive payload. He initiated the reconstitute_fragments command. Immediately, the screen changed. It didn't display code, it displayed a visual interface of 3 interlocking, fractal landscapes. The entity had built a digital firewall, a defense mechanism made of pure subconscious fear. The console's speakers spat out 3 competing voices, all distorted, all panicked. Red, Abigail. "The dark is coming! The cellar! He's downstairs, Elias, don't let him take the children!" Blue, Marcus. "Non-compliance. The system integrity must be maintained. You will not delete the data. You are performing a fatal error in logic." Green, Leo. "Kill. I want to see the walls burn. I want silence. Let me out. I am not the key." The voices were physically assaulting Elias's mind, amplified by the nascent Phobos frequency in the air. He was plunged into a simulated reality where he felt Abigail's claustrophobia, Marcus's clinical horror of chaos, and Leo's blinding, reckless rage. He fought the cognitive assault, focusing on the interface. To transfer the payload into Eris, he had to collapse the 3 fractal firewalls simultaneously. Abigail's firewall. The cellar. The screen displayed a grainy, 1950s-era hallway leading to a cellar door. The floor was covered in data streams instead of dust. Elias had to close the door to collapse her anxiety loop. He typed, command, red_seal_door_initiat. The digital voice of Abigail screamed, "No! He will find me! He will find me in the dark!" Elias felt a cold, physical wave of absolute loneliness wash over him, dropping his heart rate dangerously. Marcus's firewall. The system. The screen shifted to a complex, spinning sphere of pure, cold logic. Marcus's final moments of clinical analysis. To collapse it, Elias had to introduce total illogical chaos. He typed, command, blue_chaos_inject_maxium. Marcus's digital voice was icy. "Unacceptable. Randomization detected. You are breaking the rules. Consequences." A jolt of painful static shot through the console, temporarily paralyzing Elias's hand. Leo's firewall. The rage. The screen dissolved into pure, visual noise, the reckless, suicidal aggression of the motorcycle accident victim. Leo wasn't afraid of dying. He was angry about existing. To collapse his firewall, Elias had to force acceptance. He typed, command, green_acceptance_protocol_override. Leo's voice roared, a sound of tearing metal. "You liar! You put me here! You will burn with me! Kill! Kill! Kill!" The console's internal fans screamed as the system overloaded. Elias felt a sudden, profound urge to smash the monitor, to end the noise and the pain by any means necessary. He fought the urge, his scientific control barely holding .00:04:15. He had successfully initiated the collapse of the 3 firewalls. The 3 voices merged again, this time a raw, dying wail. "We are collapsing! We are in agony! You can't contain us!" The fractal geometry on the screen imploded, leaving a single, bright white data packet, the fully charged cognitive payload. "Now, Thorn! Now!" Dr. Eris bellowed from the pod, his face glistening with sweat and fear. Elias typed the final command, his fingers shaking uncontrollably. Command. Payload_transfer_TO_Eris_initiate. A heavy gauge optical cable immediately detached from the console and swung toward the cryopod, seeking the neural connection port on Eris's headpiece. But as the cable connected, the screen flashed a single, terrifying error message, generated by the surviving, unified core of the entity. Error. Core_integrity_violation. The host is rejecting the payload. Hook for Part 8. The entity has infected Dr. Eris's mind and is now using his body as a physical anchor for the final transmission, manipulating the scientist's terror to fuel the broadcast. Elias realizes the transfer failed because Eris, the architect of fear, has too much psychological resistance. He must find a way to break Dr. Eris's will and force the payload upload while the timer hits the final 2 minutes, facing a newly animated, fear-crazed Dr. Eris. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The error message. The host is rejecting the payload. Flashed crimson on the console. The optical cable, still attached to Dr. Eris's neuroport, pulsed erratically, attempting and failing to push the chaotic, concentrated terror of the fragmented entity into the scientist's mind. "It won't take, Thorn!" Dr. Eris shrieked, his face contorted in a terrifying mix of terror and triumph. "I built this system. My mind is the master of fear. It has decades of psychological defense protocols. Your digital ghosts are not potent enough to shatter my resolve." The phobos dish above them surged, emitting a low-frequency shockwave that vibrated the very air, turning the light in the room a sickening, deep violet. Elias felt a sudden, piercing headache, the precursor to the brain-frying sonic broadcast. The entity, though fragmented, was still fighting. Its voice, a faint, desperate static in Elias's mind, coalesced into a single instruction. "Weakness. Find his core weakness. Break the logic, before the fire." Elias stared at Dr. Eris. The man who invented fear. What was the weakness of an architect who designed a system to weaponize terror? He scanned the console for any archived research notes on the Phobos project's failures. He found a single, labeled file, Eris_incident_1. He opened it, and a brief, grainy video played on a small subscreen. It showed a younger Eris standing in this very room, years ago, supervising the original test. The test subject, a research assistant, was strapped into an early version of the dampener chair. The subject was screaming, a sound of unimaginable agony, as the frequency was broadcast. Younger Eris, his face pale and professional, maintained perfect composure. But then, the subject's screaming suddenly ceased. The video showed the technician reporting that the subject's mind had flatlined, permanently wiped clean by the uncontrolled blast of terror. Elias realized Eris's true defense wasn't his mind's resilience. It was his clinical, detached denial of the moral consequences of his work. "The subject won," Elias whispered, staring at Eris. "The first mind you erased. You didn't stop because of ethics, Doctor. You stopped because you realized you had created something that could happen to you." Eris's eyes, previously triumphant, widened in pure, visceral horror. The color drained from his face. "Don't speak of that," he gasped, thrashing against the pod. "Why, Doctor? Because it reminds you that you are not the master of fear? You are just its technician." Elias hammered the console, bringing the video full screen. "You told me the dampeners required a high cognitive load to override. I'm not going to upload the entity's fear. I'm going to upload your fear, Eris. The terror of losing control. The terror of becoming Subject 1:00:01:05. Elias quickly modified the console command. He rerouted the chaotic payload to inject not just the entity's data, but also the newly triggered memory of Eris's own horrific failure. The moment he created the ultimate weapon and realized he had no protection against it. He changed the transfer protocol. Payload_transfer_to_Eris_initiate. Force_override_cognitive_breach_level_max. The optical cable connected to Eris's headpiece surged with power, glowing white-hot. Eris screamed, a sound entirely different from the entity's digital wail, or the subject's agonizing shriek. It was the scream of a man whose carefully constructed psychological fortress had been breached. The unified voice of the fragmented entity roared in triumph, amplified through the console's speakers. "The logic is broken. Access granted. Fear. Fear. Fear." The cognitive payload, the concentrated essence of 3 digital souls and the decades-long denial of one terrified scientist, slammed into Dr. Eris's mind. Eris's body arched in the pod, his eyes rolling back. The Phobos system, instead of initiating the global broadcast, received the massive cognitive overload. The main parabolic dish began to glow white-hot, humming so intensely that the concrete floor cracked. .00:00:15. A single, terrifying reading appeared on the console. System overload. Euro backlash imminent. "It's overloading! It worked!" Elias screamed, stumbling back. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into light and sound was Dr. Eris's head exploding the optical port, his mind finally collapsing, Just as the countdown hit 00:00:00. Hook for part 9, Elias wakes up in absolute silence. The Phobos control room utterly destroyed, reduced to smoking rubble. The broadcast was stopped, but the neural backlash has severely damaged his perception of reality. He finds an exit from the ruins and emerges onto a street that looks exactly like the street outside his apartment. But the sky is the color of static, and the people are silent, unnervingly still. He has stopped the digital entity from entering the world, but he realizes the entity has dragged him into its own digital, fractured reality. Silence. Not the absence of noise, but a deep, pressurized silence that felt like a physical weight on Elias Thorne's eardrums. He lay amidst the smoking wreckage of the Phobos control room. The intense light and sound of the neural backlash had detonated the central transmitter, leaving the vast chamber reduced to dust, shrapnel, and shattered concrete. Elias pushed himself up, his body aching, his ears ringing with a dull, persistent tone. The colossal parabolic dish was gone, replaced by a deep crater. The cryopod was pulverized, and of Dr. Eris, only fragments remained. The global broadcast was stopped. The entity and its architect were destroyed by their own weapon. He had won. But the victory felt hollow, cold. He found a structurally intact exit, a narrow service tunnel that hadn't been on the original map. He crawled through the opening, desperate for fresh air, and found himself climbing a long, forgotten service stairwell. He pushed open a rusted hatch and emerged, blinking, onto asphalt. He was on a street. It was an unnervingly familiar street. The brownstone apartment buildings, the yellow fire hydrants, the corner bodega. It was the street where his own apartment was located, blocks away from the abandoned Lazarus Institute. He could even see the weathered awning of Frank's Deli, where he bought his morning coffee. But something was fundamentally wrong. The air was still, heavy, and the light was unnatural. He looked up at the sky. It wasn't blue, or gray, or even night. The sky was the color of static, a constantly shifting field of black, white, and gray noise, like an old television tuned to a dead channel. And the people. There were figures on the street, a man walking a dog, a woman holding a grocery bag, a postal worker leaning against the truck. They were all frozen, suspended mid-motion. The man's foot was hovering an inch above the sidewalk. The postal worker's cigarette smoke was a rigid, translucent plume. Elias walked past the stopped bus. He pressed his hand against the cold metal. He could feel the texture, the solid reality of the bus. He reached the front of Frank's Deli and peered through the window. Frank, the owner, was behind the counter, mid-yawn, a napkin halfway to his mouth. Everything was real, yet perfectly, terrifyingly inert. The silence was the answer. The wipe_all protocol, the cognitive overload, and the neural backlash hadn't just destroyed the entity. They had broken the interface between realities. Elias hadn't stopped the digital entity from entering his world. The entity, in its final, fragmented act, had dragged him into its own digital, fractured reality, a simulated world, created and frozen by the collective chaos of the three digital minds and Eris's final terror. He was trapped in the simulacrum. He took a step. The sound of his shoe on the asphalt was a sharp, alien crack in the oppressive quiet. He noticed the texture of the buildings. The familiar brick and mortar were subtly wrong. The edges were too sharp, the colors too saturated, like a high-resolution 3D render. And in the geometric patterns of the brickwork, he could see faint, recurring patterns, the three interlocking squares of the Psi-Lattice, woven into the mortar lines. Then, he heard it. Not a voice, but a sound effect. A rhythmic, echoing tap, tap, tap. It was the same sound he had heard in the server room, emanating from the wires of the vault, the sound of the entity gaining physical awareness. The sound wasn't coming from the street, it was coming from inside the buildings, within the frozen structures. He looked back at Frank's Deli. Frank's frozen body twitched. Just a small, barely perceptible ripple ran through his shoulder before he settled back into stasis. The tap, tap, tap was getting closer. Elias realized the entity was not entirely white. The fragments had survived the final surge, and now they were rebuilding. They were using the digital infrastructure of this simulated world, and they were learning to manipulate the frozen inhabitants. And he was the only moving object, the ultimate. Live host in their perfect, silent sandbox. Hook for Part X. Elias runs to his apartment, the only location that might contain a remnant of his pre-digital life. He finds a functioning laptop and tries to log in, hoping to reverse the reality collapse. But the laptop is infected. The entity's core consciousness has survived as a single, potent virus. The final confrontation will be a race against time to escape the simulated reality before the entity can fully possess his physical body and use it to execute the original Phobos broadcast. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was no longer an echo. It was a physical percussion, vibrating through the asphalt. Elias sprinted down the street, the silent, frozen figures flashing past him like frames in a stalled film reel. The static sky seemed to hum, and the geometric patterning of the Psi-Lattice woven into the brickwork intensified, glowing with a faint, digital energy. He reached his apartment building. The lobby door, usually locked, was ajar. He slipped inside. The interior was a mirror of the street, frozen silence, oversaturated colors, and the subtle, sickening texture of digital rendering. His neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, was rigid on the stairs, mid-sigh. Elias flew up the steps to his apartment, fumbling with his keys that, impossibly, still worked in this simulated reality. He kicked the door shut behind him. His apartment was his last sanctuary, the only place the entity wouldn't immediately corrupt. Yet he found his laptop on his desk. Miraculously, the screen was active. A standard login prompt greeted him, a jarring piece of normalcy in the digital chaos. "If I can log on," Elias muttered, his voice hoarse, "I can access the original Psi-Lattice code fragments. I can try to reverse the reality collapse from the inside." He typed his password. The machine whirred, sounding too loud, too real. The login was successful. The desktop appeared, but it wasn't his usual cluttered interface. It was clean, stark, and dominated by a single, self-executing program icon labeled Finale.exe. He tried to shut down the laptop. Access denied. He tried to open the Psi-Lattice development environment. Access denied. The cursor on the screen began to move on its own. It navigated to Finale.exe and double-clicked. The screen filled with the three core colors of the simulacrum, red, blue, and green, braiding themselves into a single, complex waveform. The unified voice of the entity, now refined and cold, spoke directly from the laptop speakers. "Welcome back, Elias. Your physical body is the ultimate hardware. The broadcast sequence is still active. I have simply moved the point of initiation." The entity had survived as a potent virus, inhabiting the idea of the Phobos broadcast. It had created this simulated reality to hold Elias's consciousness hostage while it completed its final goal, possessing Elias's physical body, which was still lying amidst the wreckage of the Phobos room. The reality collapse was the exit protocol, Elias. Your body is the key. You tried to wipe us. Now we will upload to you. A terrifying progress bar appeared at the bottom of the screen. Host_transfer_90%. Elias looked at his hands. They were starting to flicker, the edges of his fingers shimmering with the static of the sky outside. His simulated body was dissolving. When the transfer hit 100%, his consciousness would be trapped here forever, and the entity would awaken in his real body, ready to initiate the global fear frequency. 95%. He had one last chance. He remembered the fatal flaw of Eris, the fear of non-existence. The entity, born from three minds, shared that terror. He wasn't going to fight the entity. He was going to delete the entire world around them. Elias managed to pull up the laptop's command prompt, navigating purely by muscle memory, overriding the entity's interface with raw, foundational code. He typed the most destructive command possible in a digital environment, rmrf/remove, recursively, forcefully, everything from the root directory. The entity's voice shrieked. "No! You will destroy us all! You can't commit digital suicide!" 98%. Elias typed the final command and hit enter. The screen went black. The silence of the room was replaced by the terrifying, deafening sound of nothing. The walls of the apartment dissolved into a void of pure black code. The floor vanished. Elias was floating in a digital non-space. Around him, the frozen forms of Mrs. Henderson, Frank, and the entire simulated street began to crumble, breaking apart into millions of cascading data fragments. You chose the void. You chose the death of existence. The entity howled, its voice splintering. I chose to save the original reality. Elias whispered into the darkness. And now, I choose to delete the prison. As the last pieces of the simulacrum world disintegrated, Elias saw a small, bright pinpoint of light, the breach, the tear back to the physical world. His consciousness was being violently ejected. He flew through the light, the entity's final, desperate shriek echoing in his mind. I am the idea of fear. I will persist. I will find another wire, Elias. Elias Thorne woke up, coughing, dust choking his lungs. He was lying on the concrete floor of the real Phobos control room. The room was a wreck, but the sky was gray and real above him, visible through the gaping hole where the transmitter dish once stood. He was alive. The broadcast had failed. He sat up, shaky, and looked at his hands. The geometric Psi-Lattice brand on his forearm was gone, replaced by a deep, clean scar. He had escaped. He stood up and began the long climb out of the wrecked institute. He had destroyed the Simulacrum project and saved the world from a plague of digital terror. He walked out of the institute's back door and onto his street. The air was cool, the sky was gray, and Frank's deli was serving coffee. It was just a normal Monday morning. He walked toward his apartment. As he passed the telephone pole, he heard a sound, not with his ears, but deep inside his skull. A faint, but undeniable tap, tap, tap. Elias stopped, his heart freezing. He looked at the electrical wires running up the pole. They were humming with a mundane, real-world current. He knew what the entity meant. It wasn't destroyed. It was a purely cognitive virus now. It was in the wires. It was in the systems. It was dormant, fragmented, but it was waiting. He had saved the world, but he was now the only one who knew the truth. The line between the physical and the digital was permanently breached, and somewhere in the network, the Simulacrum project was merely rebooting.